Hi everyone. Today we're going to be learning about materials transport in plants. In other words, how do plants move the raw materials that they gather from their environment around inside themselves? Of course, if you need to get a hold of me, my email address is on the screen. That's always the best way. If you don't have your science notebook, a pencil, and some colored pencils, please gather those up now. Here we go. So here are our objectives for today. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain materials transport, moving things around, in something called vascular plants. I also need you to be able to list the two main transport systems in plants and describe the types of materials they move. So plants have two types of transport systems. You need to be able to explain what transpiration is and how it works. Explain what sap is and what types of materials can be found in it. And here we go. All right, so I think anytime we look at plants moving materials around, it's handy for us to look at something maybe we know a bit more about to begin with. And of course, I want us to look at the human circulatory system. So the circulatory system, and as we look at this diagram here on the left-hand side, you can see that the circulatory system is made of this branching network, really of vessels or pipes. You can see that those pipes get smaller the further they get into the legs and the arms. And so those pipes carry blood, and that blood in it carries lots of things that the cells in our body need. So sometimes this is called the cardiovascular system or just the vascular system. But so, we have blood in our circulatory system that we use to move materials around. Now we move nutrients and food, water, oxygen, hormones to help us grow and to regulate body processes. But all of those materials are moved in our circulatory system. Think of it as like a superhighway that delivers materials that every cell needs. Now, if you think a little bit, just beginning about plants and what you already know, you may realize that you know that plants have some sort of system to move things around. Many of you might have looked at the back of a leaf and you've seen this branching network on the back of a leaf, and you can see that we have the pipes that get smaller and smaller, but they seem to go everywhere within the leaf. These are actually called leaf veins, and uh, you know these are actually used for transport. So we need to kind of build on what you already know here. But the veins in a leaf are actually part of that transport system. That's the visible part that we can see in a leaf. So two transport systems. The first transport system that I want you to think about is something called the xylem. Okay? So the xylem, it says, is a system of tiny tubes that transports water to every cell in a plant. So this is the water transport system. Of course, water is absorbed at the roots. It's going to travel through this system of tiny tubes. It will travel up through the stem, travel into all the leaves. But this is plant plumbing, if you want to think about it like this, and know that this is a one-way system. Plants absorb the water that they need from their roots, from the ground, from the soil, and it is an upward system. So the water transport system, the tubes that transport water, we call that the xylem. Okay. Uh, the second, the second system that plants have do not transport water specifically. They are actually going to transport food, and so we call this the phloem. Of course, food, sugar, is made by photosynthesis in the leaves, and it has to make it. That food that the leaves make has to make it to all of the other plant cells, whether they're in the roots or the stem, or even upwards into flowers. So the thing that you should know about the phloem is this is a two-way system. So, if food is made in the leaves, the phloem, these tiny tubes, are going to transfer that food up, and they're going to also be able to transport it down. So, that's a major difference. One of the systems transports mostly water, while the other transports mostly food. One is a one-way system, the other is a two-way system. The xylem and the phloem. These are the two major bits that you need to understand when you think about plant transport. Two systems, xylem and phloem, one for food, one for water. one two-way, one one-way. I do want to point out that these systems are completely separate. And by that, I mean that they don't share piping. And that might seem a little strange, but there is no shared piping. It's kind of like the hot and the cold water that runs to your faucet. Of course, if we mix that water together, we would just end up with warm water. But we want either hot or we want cold. So plants have two piping systems, the xylem and the phloem, and they're completely separate. And if you think about it, this is very much like the human circulatory system that moves blood around. And so, if you think about how our circulatory system looks and how it operates, the plant system operates in much the same way. So, any plant that has a xylem and a phloem, in other words, they are able to transport materials like this, whether it's the sugar going down or the water, and of course that water has some dissolved minerals in it, the water going up, we say that those are vascular plants. So vascular plants have vascular systems that allow them to transport materials. I need you to know most plants are vascular. There's only a very few plants that are very simple plants that don't have these, that are not vascular, that don't have the xylem and the phloem. Things like mosses are an example of non-vascular plants. And all of these plants, remember, are just vascular plants, are all going to have xylem and phloem, a way to transport that food and that water throughout the plant and to every cell. One of the best ways that I have found to think about the xylem and the phloem is to think about the inside of a plant, particularly like a stem, as being a bunch of straws that have been clamped together like this. And so, we might find on the outside here, we might find this to be the phloem, and we might find on the inside, we might find these to be the xylem, and this would just be other plant tissue that's not used. But usually you see some kind of separation like this. Remember, this plumbing is in the leaves, it's in the roots, it's in the stems. This plumbing has to go everywhere to every living plant cell. But a series of straws or tubes, piping, plumbing, however you want to think about it, that's what the xylem and the phloem are. It's natural that when we talk about this movement of water in particular in a plant, that we also talk about something you learned about in 5th grade. When you learned about the water cycle, you learned about something called transpiration. And so you can see down here on this diagram, we have these plants, and they call it evapotranspiration. That's because transpiration happens through evaporation. But transpiration is part of the water cycle, and we can look at that diagram and get a pretty good idea of what's happening here. You can see that you have water being absorbed from the roots, from the soil. So water is absorbed into the roots from the soil, passes up the plant, passes up through the stem, and eventually it arrives at the leaves, always moving upward. It is moving upward in large part due to energy from the sun. So sunlight actually is what powers this process, along with some of those properties of water. But once we get to the leaves, that water evaporates out into the air. In other words, it turns from a liquid into a gas, and it moves into the air or into the atmosphere. So this continual flow of water through the soil, through plants, and into the atmosphere as water vapor, that's what transpiration is water passing through plants and then evaporating. So really, you need to know this is part of the water cycle. Of course, the entire water cycle is powered by the sun. And I want you to know that plants use this for really two purposes. The first thing they use it for is this is a great way for cooling. It works a little bit like sweat on your own body. You get sweat on your skin, and you might notice that that is one way that you can cool your body. You might feel cooler after you actually begin sweating. You don't overheat. Well, plants use it in this transpiration in much the same way. So it's okay to think of this a little bit as plant sweat. But they also use it just for moving water. And so transpiration is also just for moving water through the plant. This flow is continual. Plants are always moving water from the roots through the stem, through the leaves. If that water, that flow upwards of water were to stop, if transpiration were to stop, the plant would die. During some really extreme droughts, it is not uncommon to see plants die because there wasn't enough water in the system, and You may notice that they begin wilting. They actually lose pressure in the system. It's called tuber pressure. They actually will lose that, and eventually, if there's not water, if there becomes a place in the pipes where there's not water, it becomes impossible for the water to be passed up, and the plant will die. So transpiration, continual flow of water through plants, are the water cycle, and it's used for cooling, and also plants use it to move water up, to supply water to all the parts of the plant. Last thing I want us to look at is something else that you're familiar with, and that's something we call sap. And this is a plant called milkweed, and if you pare or cut a milkweed plant, you're going to find that some of the sap will just ooze right out of it. Okay, so what we're seeing here is we're seeing this sap is traveling. This type of sap is traveling in the phloem. So this is food rich. This has the sugar in it that was made by photosynthesis. Um, but sap in general is the liquid, is the name for the liquid that moves through the xylem or the phloem. It could be either one. Now, I want to point out that the sap that we find in the xylem is much different than the sap that we find in the phloem. The sap that we find in the xylem is going to be thinner, maybe not as viscous, and by that I mean it's going to be much runnier. It doesn't have as much sugar in it. Okay, so the sap in the phloem is going to have a lot more sugar in it, and as a result, it's going to be much thicker sap like this. If you've ever seen stuff like this, resin or sap running down a tree, then you know what I'm talking about. That stuff can be quite sticky. So really, sap is just our blood. You can think of it as plant blood. Sap is very similar to our blood. Our blood is used to transport our blood is mostly water. It's used to transport materials to every cell in our body. That is exactly what plants use sap for. They're going to move food molecules. They're going to move sugars to all the cells. The minerals that are dissolved in the water that the roots absorbed. They're going to move those to all the cells. They're going to move the hormones that allow them to respond to their environment, so that they know what growing season it is and what they need to be working on. Do I need to go dormant? All of those materials are going to be moved through the sap. And so sap is really plant blood, and it is used to transport materials around. It's I guess, the medium or the liquid that those materials get moved in. So we need to take a few notes that'll help us out. Not many here, so I'm going to need you to go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to copy these notes exactly as you see them into your science notebook. I want you to take notes that will tell you about the xylem, the phloem, vascular. I need you to understand what vascular is and remember that. I'll be able to define transpiration and also a quick definition for sap. So if you'll pause the video and go ahead and copy these notes in your notebook, then restart the video. All right, so our goal today is, if we're going to do something just for fun, our lab is we're going to look at celery. And this is a pretty simple experiment, but it takes a while. The first thing you're going to need to find is 2 stalks of celery from your kitchen. Check the refrigerator. It's okay if the celery you have in the refrigerator looks old or wilted. Just choose. The thing I want you to choose is the stalks of celery that have the most leaves on top. Okay? So after you have your celery, you only need 2 stalks. You're going to need to find 2 cups. Regular drinking glasses or cups will work just fine. The heavier the better. So if they're made out of glass, as long as you're careful, that will be great. You'll also need some red food coloring and some blue food coloring. Once you have those materials, your celery, your cups, and some food coloring, I think you'll be ready to go. So to perform our experiment, you're going to fill both of the glasses half full of water. And in one of those glasses, you're going to add some red food coloring. You'll add blue to the other. Now, you want to add enough food coloring to make sure the water turns really dark. Generally, it depends on the size of the glass, of course, and how much water you're using, but 15 to 20 drops in a cup of water would work really well. So about 15 to 20 drops. You want it to be almost so dark that you can't see through the food coloring. Okay, so we've got our food coloring and our water. The next thing we need to do is make a fresh cut at the bottom of each celery stalk. So just take a kitchen knife, be careful, and I want you to cut the bottom of the celery stalk off. We want a fresh cut so that we can perform our experiment. And then we just need to drop our celery in the cups. So we'll drop it with the bottom down. Okay, so the bottom part is the wide part. Sometimes it's white in color. We're going to put that inside the food coloring and leaves up, and we're going to leave it there. It's best if you can leave this for an entire day. 24 hours is really wonderful. You can go back and check on it as it's working, but don't don't do the next bit of this lab until it has been at least an entire day. So after 24 hours, grab your notebook, grab your color pencils, grab a pencil, and I want you to go look at the celery. I want you to go pay attention to the leaves. I want you to take that knife. I want you to cut the celery about halfway up, and I want you to look inside, look and see what you see. See if you can see the xylem. Remember, we put the celery in water, but it had some food coloring, so maybe that food dye is going to help make some things visible that weren't before. Pay attention. See if you can tear the celery apart and remove any of the new structures that hopefully have become dyed in your celery. Take some notes in your notebook and you'll be done for the day. Well, guys, I guess that does it for now. I hope you'll stay curious, and until next time, peace.